Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Tonight we have a Perfumers portfolio video, and it's actually on a master perfumer who does not get enough credit in the community. And reason being is he's one of those perfumers who only created a handful of scents. So what he reminds me of is he reminds me of a pitcher in baseball who was unhittable, but only for a couple years. Or somebody like Bo Jackson, especially being a Raider fan. Imagine somebody like Bo Jackson having an entire career, right, of 10 to 12 years as a running back, which was possible back then. Instead, he only lasted 4 years, right? But during those 4 years, you couldn't bring the guy down. He was an absolute beast, right? That's kind of the feeling that I get with Jean Martel, because he only created, in my collection, there's only 2 fragrances that I'm going to have to show in this list. Now, obviously, Jean Martel, the perfumer, has done more than just 2 perfumes, but the other fragrances that he has done, for example, Dimitri Revolution by Bourticario, I've never smelled, and then I think he did a Milaschon fragrance potentially, which I've never smelled the Milaschon fragrance, but the 2 big hits that he has on his hands, it's really not even a surprise, because if you're a fragrance lover or connoisseur, or you were even around in the 1970s and 80s, you probably inhaled a lot of fumes from fragrances that Jean Martel created. To me, he's a little bit of a master of the fougere, because both of his fragrances we're going to discuss today have these fougere type tendencies, although the Dior fragrance, which we're going to talk about at the end of the video, sort of has these leathery fougere tendencies that almost morph a little bit into a Chypre with a little bit of a Russian leather base. So we are going to rank this, even though there's only 2 fragrances. I have to say that this is actually one of the hardest rankings I've ever done, and I'll tell you why. So the biggest reason is that these 2 fragrances for me are absolute all-stars. So we have Paco Rabanne pour Homme from 1973, and Paco Rabanne pour Homme is not just sort of a revolutionary fragrance in its category and when it came out and its place in history, and of course it sort of changed the landscape of the 70s to go towards this very clean, green, soapy aromatic fougere, one of the reference aromatic fougeres, I think. And the other reason for me why this is such a tough reference is that is my father's signature scent, is from the time I was born until today, and I'm 38 years old. He wears Paco Rabanne pour Homme. It is his signature scent. Men used to do that back in the day. They would pick a fragrance, and that was their fragrance for life kind of thing, and that's my old man. And so for me, this fragrance has a lot of personal significance to me. And I think just because of my taste in perfume, I think I would probably rate Dior Jules #1 still, even though, Paco Rabanne pour Homme is one of the greatest fougères ever created, I would say. But because of the significance that it has personally on me, it was very hard for me to rank this video and put Paco Rabanne pour Homme anything but #1 on the list, just because of the effect that it had on me. I may not be doing these videos, even have a YouTube channel or have a fragrance obsession, without something like Paco Rabanne pour Homme. There were many, many days that I remember going out on the weekends with my old man, and of course, he would put it in his hands and put it on his face because he would use the aftershave and stuff like that. But many, many Saturday mornings, going to the zoo, going to the park, this is the smell of what a man should smell like for me as a young kid, right? So very hard to rank that anything except #1 because of the impact it had. But on the other side of the coin, we have Dior Jules, which actually is my scent of the day and inspired this video. And yesterday, I actually did a Perfumers portfolio video on Raymond Chailan. I would go check that out if you can. Raymond Chailan is another very underappreciated perfumer. He was a perfumer who really wanted to give back and felt like perfumers deserved more of the limelight, and they deserve to be accredited and appreciated in all of the things that he sort of fought for, and maybe even still fights for. He has a son who is big into the perfume world as well. He is a perfumer himself. He has a son who is also a perfumer. But if you go check that video out, if you want to see more of a traditional Perfumers portfolio video that I've done, I have some playlists on the channel as well. But normally my Perfumers portfolio videos run about an hour. This one's going to be a little bit shorter because, again, there's only a handful of fragrances. But I really believe that Jean Martel deserves to be recognized, and that's what this channel is all about. That is actually the reason I founded the channel, is because I wanted to do the type of videos that I wanted to do, and I didn't want to be beholden to whatever the Free Bottle Brigade was doing. I didn't want to be beholden to the fact that I had to do a particular review because they were basically paying me to do it, or, you know what I mean? The freedom to be able to jump around however I would like. And I talked about that in some of my previous videos, how, just randomly last week, I reviewed some vintage discontinued EDT gray cap creeds out of the blue. Sometimes I just get those sort of inklings, right? And Jean Martel, as a as a perfumer who had this sort of impact on the industry, reminds me of another perfumer who I'm going to do a Perfumers portfolio video on as well, and his name is Ron Winograd. And the reason I mention it is both Ron Winograd and Jean Martel created a handful of fragrances, maybe like a couple fragrances for Jean Martel, 3 to 4, 5 fragrances for Ron Winograd, that are absolute just stunners. You know what I mean? Just almost reference fragrances in their category. And so even though they don't have this long, drawn-out career like Pierre Bourdon or like Jean-Claude Elena, right? They don't have the weight of the releases behind them as far as the number of releases that they've done, the impact that each release has had. So for Ron Winograd, it was Furio, and it was Dunhill Blend 30, absolute all-time great fragrances. Something like Lagerfeld Cologne, which then became Lagerfeld Classic, just the one I had at hand. The Cologne version is better, though, if you can find the Lagerfeld Cologne. So I'm going to do a Perfumers portfolio video on Ron Winograd as well. But the reason I bring that up is there are perfumers who, if you go through my playlist, you'll notice many of the big names are already X'd out. So I did the Thierry Vasseurs and the Francois Demachis and the Edmund Rudnitskas, and, a lot of the big names that come to mind, Pierre Bourdon, Michel Almerac, I've already done videos on. And the reality for me is that somebody like Jean Martel, when you go to Google or any of your search engines and try to find information on Jean Martel, it's almost like he's a ghost. There's literally almost nothing on the man. And so all we have to go off of are his 2 creations, Jules and, for me, Paco Rabanne pour Homme. So this is going to be sort of a little bit of a ramble video, but this is an homage. This is a almost thank you from me to Jean Martel for these creations. And if other people appreciate his creations as well, this is an opportunity to sort of highlight them and give them the limelight. And so today I actually wore Jules as my scent of the day. We'll talk a little bit about that once we get to it. But let's start with Paco Rabanne pour Homme. So just sort of a high-level overview. I'm going to do an individual review on pretty much every single fragrance that I have in my collection at some point. That's the point of the channel. I want this channel to be a little bit of a library. We can go to the playlist, you can sort of click on the brand, you can find the multiple reviews, and so ultimately for me, you will see a full review on every fragrance. As long as I have time on the earth to do it, I'm gonna make that happen. That's my plan with the channel, is I want to have a little bit of an encyclopedia where you can sort of get my thoughts and feedback and stuff like that if you're interested. And so these will be Hall of Fame reviews, though. I set up sort of a vintage Hall of Fame review sort of playlist, and just a Hall of Fame for the more modern niche stuff, like Diaghilev made the Hall of Fame playlist video that I made. And so these will get individual reviews, but just sort of a high-level overview for those of you who are not as familiar with Paco Rabanne pour Homme and Dior Jules. So Paco Rabanne pour Homme came out in 1973, and it is sort of the, in my mind, it is the masculine fragrance that actually set the next 20 years of perfume history on its track for the masculine side of things. And the reason I say that is this is a green, somewhat modern take on a fougere, if you will. And Paco Rabanne pour Homme what makes it so interesting and I would say influential is there's just a little bit of dihydromercenol, and there's some big, I would say, debates in the fragrance community whether Jean Martel really purposely used this new ingredient expertly like he did, because dihydromercenol can be one of those ingredients that adds this air of sort of freshness to it. If you think of the fresh 80s scent, so fast forward a decade from when Paco Rabanne Pour Homme came out, and think of something like this, right? Think of Drakkar Noir. For me, this is like the dihydromercenol, you know, the face of dihydromercenol in the 1980s. And this is sort of the 80s fresh dihydromercenol feel that I think about when I think about how that decade progressed from Paco Rabanne Pour Homme to Drakkar Noir. And then, of course, dihydromercenol was continually used in the 80s in many of the fresher scents, but it really got its start in Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. And what's so amazing about Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, personally to me, is how you can have this fragrance that is green and aromatic. It's got that aromatic fougere quality to it. And yet it retains this soapy element without being boring. So in one of the live streams I was in recently, the question came up, can you make a soapy fragrance not boring? And of course, they were talking about shower gel in particular, but I think many soapy, clean fragrances do come across as boring to me. Not Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, because Paco Rabanne Pour Homme has this intricacy to it. It has this these layers, this texture. And that's one thing that you will notice with Jean Martel's perfumes, both of them that we're going to discuss today. If I could use one word to sort of describe him, it's texture. Because what he's done with Paco Rabanne Pour Homme is he's added Brazilian rosewood in the top, which is one of my favorite sort of, I would say, unsung hero notes, if you will. I absolutely love rosewood. I've talked about it in the past, how my mother actually had a rosewood rosary, and she would make me pray it when I was a kid with her every single Easter. And so that rosewood smell is almost like ingrained in, you know, almost like ingrained in me. And I love when there's a beautiful rosewood note in the perfumes. And so here, beautiful rosewood with rosemary. And rosemary, of course, comes across as a very particular smell, but a very traditionally masculine smell. It adds a slight bit of, I would say, oiliness to the composition, if you will. And there is this, you know, for Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, I really feel like this was, you have to remember that Paco Rabanne already had the women's fragrance out at the time. I believe Calendra came out in the late 1960s. And so at this point in his career, he was sort of wanting to be known as this sci-fi, you know, if you look at some of his shows with the metal sort of, you know, I would say designs that he was putting on his models and stuff like that. He was a very flamboyant designer, but he had a specific, you know, he had a very specific sort of, when you think about Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, a specific image would come to mind. Paco Rabanne as a house in general, and these sort of metallic, you know, this is what he was known for when he created his fashion lines as well. And so you can see sort of the metallic on the, and it was with the splash as well, sort of the metallic cap. Very few people were doing something like this. If you can, now there's like 5 different versions of Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, what makes it a little hard to track down exactly which version you're going to get, but I'm going to simplify it for you. If you want to smell what I would consider to be the proper Paco Rabanne bottles, get the ones with the raised R. Now, some people will take issue with that and say, no, you have to get this specific one because there's like 5 different versions. It's been reformulated many a times. If you have a bottle with the raised R, to me, you're perfectly fine. Doesn't matter, you know, which particular version you have. If you have the raised R, you're in the right era as far as I'm concerned. And what they've done is they worked with this brilliant lavender note. So this is a proper fougere, and it's actually perfect for, in my mind, spring and summer. I love wearing these type of fragrances in spring and summer. I know there's a lot of people that love wearing fougères in the cold. I prefer to wear my fougères in the heat. And especially because it has that green tint with the soapy aspect and a little bit of peppery geranium. The geranium can come across as very green, but it also adds to that cleanly side of things because it's slightly spicy, slightly green, slightly rosy, and that, of course, soapiness of Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. It is a fragrance that really speaks and touches my heart because, of course, from my father's signature scent. There are spices, and the final bit in here, which, you know, as a high-level overview to someone who's never smelled it, one of the things that I think really keeps this fragrance from being too boring, because I mentioned, of course, that soapy side of things, right, is the honey. There is an animalic honey in the base that almost smells a little bit like a fruit conserve. So if you've ever had, you know, fruit conserve jellies or something like that, you'll sort of have an idea. The honey gives it a little bit of that fruit conserve-like smell, but it's an animalic honey. And that's the thing that keeps this fragrance so interesting, is that in 1973, people didn't just want a clean dihydromercenol soapy scent. That's not what they wanted. This was still the 70s. And of course, we're still a little bit behind the animalic, dirty era of the 1980s. But even then, they didn't want that just clean, soapy. That's not what people were wearing, not what men were interested in wearing back then. And so keeping with the green theme and the fougere theme, and even as that soapiness tends to come in, what you end up getting in the base is that brilliant animalic honey that I think sort of gives it that, instead of just fading away into that soapiness, it fades away into a little bit of this dirty animalic. And you have to remember, bees are dirty. That's one thing a lot of people don't realize. Bees actually do stink. Rich Mitch has done many talks where he's talked about this fact that bees are dirty creatures. They do not smell good. They stink. If you're around beehives, you'll be able to smell them. And the honey in this just gives it this, I love a good honey note in a good perfume, and it just gives it this perfect tint of animalic, this perfect balance. That's another word for, I would say, Jean Martel fragrances. They're brilliantly balanced and textured. And so both fragrances that we're going to discuss have that brilliant texture to them. And so for me, this is an absolute Hall of Fame fragrance for men from 1973, Jean Martel, Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. So that's going to be number 2 on the list. So number 1 is obviously the all-time great for me. This is the fragrance that I think if I had to wear one Jean Martel fragrance, it would be this. Not just because it's different from my old man, but because this is more to my taste. And he created this in 1980, and you have to remember, this actually preceded some of my all-time favorite fragrances. So you think about something like Koros, or you think about something like Antaeus, right? Those all came after Jules. And if you've ever heard Chris from Scentland talk about Dior Jules, he always says it's not Jules, all right? It's Jules. You have to let it melt in your mouth almost. Jules. And thank God I actually have a backup of this coming sometime in the next couple months. There is a gift coming from England by way of Poland to England, hopefully to my house in the next couple months. And there is a backup of Jules in that parcel. So this is definitely backup bottle worthy for me. This is a tough fragrance to describe, and like I said, I'll do a full review, but high-level overview for those who are sort of interested in the vintage version. Now, they re-released Jules, so you can actually still buy it, but it's completely different scent. As far as from what I hear, I've never smelled the new one, but from what I've heard from trustworthy sources, people like Rich Mitch who have actually purchased the new one and smelled it and compared it to the vintage, I've heard that the new one is much more green, and it's lost a lot of that animalic sort of, undertone to it. So that dirty castoreum, leathery undertone isn't there. It's more of a green fragrance. I hear it's nice, it's just not Jules. And so I think what Francois Demachy did, from the research I've been able to attain, is that he replaced some of that wormwood artemisia with galbanum. and in the extra amp up of galbanum that he used when he did the reformulation, I think sort of changes the makeup of the scent, if you will. So the vintage Jules, the one that I would focus on and go for if you can, is a fragrance that opens up with a big blast of wormwood. And if you've ever smelled wormwood or Artemisia, you know that it has this very bitter green-like smell. I'll give you a comparison, okay? So if you've ever smelled this is actually Amouage's Memoir Man. If you've ever smelled Memoir Man, Memoir is one of my favorite Amouage fragrances, and I believe it was the very first fragrance done by Karine Vinchon Spenner, who is big in the Amouage creation line. She's done a lot of the different Amouage fragrances. Some of my favorites over the years she has actually done. She did Myths, she did Fate Man, she did Overture Man. She did a lot of the Amouages that are some of my all-time favorites. And she did Memoir. Memoir was the first from her in 2010, when her and Christopher Chong first basically hooked up. And Memoir opens up with a big hint of wormwood. Huge. It's wormwood and absinthe with mint and basil and tarragon. A lot of green notes, okay? And so if you've ever smelled Memoir Man, believe it or not, the opening of Memoir Man, if you can imagine sort of that very green, bitter, strange vibe that Memoir Man gives you, imagine that in an 80s fragrance. So with that vintage 80s masculine sort of undertone to Jules is basically the way that that I would describe it. And so focus on the vintage if you can, but there's so many textured layers to this. The floral heart that you get in Jules is big carnation, spicy carnation, and a very peppery carnation as well, I would say. It's a very peppery, spicy carnation with cyclamen, jasmine, and rose. So those four flowers, carnation, cyclamen, jasmine, and rose, make up the vintage floral heart. And of course there's tarragon and cumin in the top. And so with that wormwood, oh, it's so good. I mean, if you've seen my Dior ranking video, by the way, I ranked my all-time favorite Dior fragrances. You'll know just how much I absolutely love Jules. And of course, as it continues to dry down, what ends up coming forward is that Russian leather, almost suede mixed with leather is the way that I would describe the dry down. But what's so beautiful about this, about Jules, to me personally, is how it starts off almost having this fougere-like vibe, almost like Jean Martel is picking up where he left off on Paco Rabanne pour Homme, and then it just takes a complete right turn and heads right into that Chypre territory with a big textured oak moss in the base. The oak moss in Jules feels like you're literally standing inside of a tree, and it's lined with oak moss. And so you can smell the beautiful woods, and that wood that you smell, it's a mixture of cedar wood and sandalwood, but the sandalwood here is brilliant. It's a brilliant sandalwood note. It's creamy, high class quality. I don't know what type of sandalwood that they used, but that wood mixture with mostly sandalwood with a little bit of cedar wood is stunning to me. And so it is right in line with the 1980s. It probably even is a fragrance that inspired some of my all-time favorite fragrances. I know there are comparisons to things like Chanel Antaeus and stuff like that. But I will tell you that if you are somebody who loves the vintage fragrance taste if you have the same taste that I have, if you love those vintage 80s masculines, with the hard, old school, take no prisoners, leather dry down, check out Jules. It is absolutely fantastic. And I know it's hard to find. I know the vintages are, you know, expensive and constantly being jacked up in price. If you find it for a good deal, I would definitely urge you to try it. And I think Jean Martel, just in general, deserves more love. You know, he's kind of one of those perfumers who, because of his very small portfolio, people tend to overlook what he did, but the releases that he had were titanic. I mean, they changed the future of perfumery. I think so many other fragrances that came after used these two creations, Paco Rabanne pour Homme and Jules, by Dior for reference, if you will, or Jules, if you will. But yes, it is just, for me, all-time great fragrances. They will get their own individual reviews, but this video is about giving Jean Martel his flowers, if you will. He deserves it. If anyone knows the story of Jean Martel, his background, I would love to know more about Jean Martel, the man. I tried to do some research. I didn't really come up with very much. And so if anyone knows sort of his history, I'd love for you guys to leave it in the comments. So since there's only 2 perfumes on the list today, this will be a much shorter ranked perfumers portfolio video, but I think a very necessary one. And especially as the weather starts to turn, it's now September while I'm doing the video. Both of these fragrances are still brilliant, but this is starting to lean more to, we're going to get into the months where these type of fragrances, which I wear in any weather anyways, but they really start to feel more weather appropriate. So yes, if you have experience with Paco Rabanne pour Homme or Jules, if you know any of the background on Jean Martel, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Appreciate the support, everyone. We are coming up on 5,000 subscribers, which I am absolutely over the moon about. I never thought we'd be at 5,000 subscribers so fast, and while you look at some of the other channels, that may not seem a lot to some people, it's a lot to me. And I am grateful and thankful for every single subscriber that I have, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor doing these videos for you guys. Appreciate you listening to the ramble today. Cheers, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.